Okay, so we're going to revise extract from the Prelude, which is in page 28 of your Power and Conflict anthology. This slide just explains what we're going to cover in this revision video recording. So we're going to look at some context of William Wordsworth and the Romantic movement that he spearheaded more or less with Samuel Coleridge. We're going to look at what happens in the poem and the different layers of meaning. We're going to look at some language and how Wordsworth expresses his ideas, and we're going to link back to context, because obviously we need to bear in mind that this poem was written in the Victorian era and very much alludes to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so on first reading, you may think that it's just about a boy who steals a little wooden boat. Actually, it is autobiographical. Wordsworth was brought up in the Lake District, and this is where it is believed he was reminiscing, having a little nostalgia trip about a memory from his own childhood. You could look at it as a boy who goes joyriding and gets a bit too big for his boots, gets frightened, and then quickly gets back to shore feeling guilty and bad about what he's done. But there's actually more to it than that. So if we consider the context, as I said before, and the poet, who was very much a romantic, and we're going to look at what that actually means, then we gain much more meaning. So yeah, it's written from the perspective of Wordsworth himself, who is reflecting on a memorable childhood experience where perhaps he does feel regret about the way he behaved, and he is reflecting on a time where he didn't appreciate nature as he should have done. So Wordsworth was part of the Romantic movement of poets, and their focus was on the experiences and emotions of mankind and the creativity of mankind. Wordsworth was particularly a leader, really, a bit of a visionary in terms of hanging on to the beauty of nature, in terms of grounding his emotions, which were obviously in a state of flux due to the Industrial Revolution, which the Romantics were so against. So obviously the Industrial Revolution was kind of on the back of, or interlinked with, the Enlightenment period, where science, reason, logic prevailed, and the Romantic movement revolted and rebelled against it. In your anthologies, you'll notice that Shelley and Blake, the two poems before the Prelude, you may already know, but they were also romantics. And whilst Browning and Tennyson's poems, the two poems after the Prelude, do seem quite different in many respects, they were both inspired from the Romantics in terms of their look at the sort of truth and emotions and the natural course of things. So there is a link there with the first 5 poems of your anthology, and if you look at the dates, they're all fairly close together. So if we look at the structure and form, let's just go through a few points. So it'd be good if you pause now. If you haven't already got the poem open in front of you in your anthology, then perhaps pause now and get that in front of you, which might be easier. So you'll see it says extract from the Prelude. So this extract forms part of an autobiographical epic, which was huge and it was really the life's work of Wordsworth, which he kept at for decades. He was in fact trying to compete with John Milton, but he actually died before it was finished, unfortunately. And his work was published posthumously by his widow. So once he'd already died, it was then published. But that was his intention, to compete with John Milton. It is a blank verse. There's no rhyme scheme. A single stanza, but plenty of enjambment where the lines run on from one to the other. And it has a cyclical structure. So the boat is taken and returned to the willow tree. And the journey is much more of a spiritual one, and can be seen in that light and how it affects the psychology of man, and particularly of Wordsworth. And that's actually more important than the literal journey. So key themes and ideas. Obviously, we're looking at man versus nature, which works well in the Power and Conflicts anthology. There are 4 things that we can think about here when we're trying to form hypotheses, depending on which poem you're comparing it with. And we'll look at some links later. So you have fear, where you're feeling overwhelmed by a new, unfamiliar world, which is obviously the Industrial Revolution and all the factories that were suddenly overshadowing the landscape. And obviously with that transformation, which obviously brought a lot of advances and progress, which seems positive, that does always come at a cost, as you well know from your studies of A Christmas Carol. Force of nature, personified as controlling and overbearing in human forms. So nature, which the Romantics saw as a thing of absolute beauty, they idolized nature. They thought that it was as if nature was their religion. But suddenly this is subverted, and suddenly nature is personified as inhuman and as threatening. So that's an interesting idea of how nature has kind of been forced out of its natural cycle, if you like. Then we have arrogance. So mankind insignificant compared with nature. Nature is superior. Again, the idea that the factories and roads were starting to invade the countryside. And we have ignorance, where the wealthy elite of Victorian society can only bring darkness and despair to the natural world. So these are ideas that are all linked, but may help you when you're forming different hypotheses. So if we look at the actual poem, obviously you're familiar with this already. So we're just kind of revising key ideas here. But let's look at the structure and language in a little bit more detail. So you all have your annotations already in your anthology. So a lot of this may be familiar, but there might be 1 or 2 things that you can add to that. So one summer evening led by her. Sometimes students aren't sure what led by her means. Invariably, any water vessel is given the female gender, but also we could look at it in a different light. We could see her being symbolic of the Romantic movement itself as feminine creativity. I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. So clearly this boat, Wordsworth as a child had seen this boat there many times, and this place was familiar to him. Straight I unloosed her chain. So this suggests that he is acting spontaneously. which again is typical of the Romantics. They liked to embrace free ideas, free thinking, going with the flow, going with their emotions. Also, the noun chain could symbolize, start to symbolize those ideas of the Industrial Revolution and the fact that they are repressing man's freedom. You'll remember in London you have the manacles, for example. So straight iron loosed her chain, so he's literally setting her free, and stepping in, pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure. So again, precise use of language there. This is an act of stealth, that noun suggesting secrecy, suggesting he knows he's doing wrong. And then obviously that's reinforced by the oxymoron troubled pleasure, which, as you know, is when two words that oppose each other are placed next to each other, and is often used in poetry. Nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on. So it's very, very silent and tranquil, which is another nice kind of nod to the serenity and beauty of nature that the Romantics championed. So leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. Again, that's very much the way of the Romantics. They beautified nature, they adored nature, they coveted the minutiae of what nature was able to do. Hence, you've got those lovely words like glittering and melted and sparkling. But now, like one who rose proud of his skill to reach a chosen point with an unswerving line, I fixed my view. Let's just look at those 3 lines there. So there's a change with the but. So we've taken a little change now in the tone. And if there's a change in a tone in poetry, it's usually known as a volta, which we really definitely see in the box next to us, where things go very wrong for Wordsworth. But here it is a little bit more subtle. So one who rose proud of his skill. So in a literal sense, he's very proud that he's rowing well. He's only a boy. He's got his kind of objective ahead of him. He's heading to the craggy ridge. But actually, if we look at the Lexis there, that idea of pride and fixed view and unswerving, inflexible, he might well be commenting on the industrialists who were so bent on going with measurements and logic and reason and technological advances that they superseded anything else, including the freedom of people and the mental health that was obviously so fragile during the Victorian age for all sorts of reasons. So we're at this point here where things are beginning to change, but we still have a handle on this beautiful romantic serenity. So upon the summit of a craggy ridge, that's where he's headed, that's where his viewpoint is, the horizon's utmost boundary, far above was nothing but the stars, all sounds beautiful still, and the grey sky. She was an elf in pinnace, so literally that just means a little boat. But again, it's kind of beautified, it's given this idolatry status. Lustily, so enthusiastically, which is another nod to the Romantics and the fact that they were so incredibly passionate about nature. So that's a precise use of an adverb there. That's a good example of that. I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke, my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. So obviously you've got a simile there, which all still sounds rather beautiful and gorgeous and serene. And then if you look as the stanza continues, because we only have one long stanza here in this extract, we very much have evidence of the use of a bolter, which is the technical term for a change, so a change in the mood or atmosphere. So when from behind that craggy steep till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head. I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature, the grim shape towered up between me and the stars. So if we just look at those first 5 or 6 lines, we have suddenly a change to the landscape. So we've had a sight of the horizon, and then suddenly it is changed. And in a literal sense, as a boy who is out on a boat in a lake, this is obviously him getting closer to the mountain, and therefore the mountain appearing to be larger and appearing to be a little bit more ominous. And obviously that ties in with perhaps his guilt for having stolen the boat and the fact that nature has witnessed that. So he's beginning to feel a little bit unsettled. But also, if we think about the world of mechanization that is suddenly overpowering the life and the landscape around them, this has suddenly upreared its head, and it would have felt sudden, and it would have felt quite frightening. The fact that Wordsworth then repeats the verb struck, I struck and struck again. So in a literal sense, sort of trying to paddle away from the enemy, as it were, the frightening, growing peak. But also, I think if we stick to the illusion of industrialization, he is trying to revolt, and we definitely get a sense of that there with I struck and struck again. He's determined, he's resolute to revolt, and he disagrees with the way things are going politically, and certainly with the fact that cities and landscapes are and the countryside are beginning to merge, and that change is happening everywhere. So factories suddenly arriving, and we could even see the sense of that in grim shape, towered up between me and the stars. So suddenly all around him he has buildings and concrete and brick, and things are getting overbearing in terms of being able to be at one with nature. And still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing. So this purposefulness of the industrialists, the measured motion like a living thing, that is, that can be seen as alluding to the industrialization and the threat of technology. So all these things feel like they're after him as an adult, but then in the literal sense of him being autobiographical and reflective about this childhood memory, also works well with strode after me, and we see that fear with trembling, that adjective, with trembling oars I turned, and through the silent water stole my way back to the covert of the willow tree. So there again you've got precise use of language, the way he's feeling. He's stealing his way back to safety, and where he feels safe, and that's back in nature. and that would be with his fellow romantics who understand him and are on the same revolutionary path. So then we have, there in her mooring place I left my bark. So he leaves the boat and through the meadows homeward went. So he returns home through nature, but mentally and psychologically and emotionally his mood has changed, and he is in serious mood, grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle, for many days my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense. So again, he's calling these new sights and sounds of the industrial world spectacles. They're abominations to him because they are man-made and they are not natural. So he is distressed. He goes on to call them unknown modes of being, and his thoughts hang in darkness. He feels isolated, he feels deserted, he feels let down, as all the romantics do, because this is such a massive national change out of nowhere. And suddenly things do not feel as they should for the romantics. There are no familiar shapes, no pleasant images of trees, no colours of green fields. Okay, so you've got the repetition there of that determiner, no. But instead of all of that beauty of nature, you've got huge and mighty forms, which takes us back to, if you look at the top of that right-hand box, we've got that huge peak, black and huge. These huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men. Again, the change in landscape and the mechanisation that is arriving everywhere. So there was obviously preceding the Industrial Revolution, you had the agricultural revolution, where everybody who worked the land was suddenly replaced with machinery. So moved slowly through the mind by day and were a trouble to my dreams. So the boy in the boat whose joyriding experience went wrong, he suffers guilt and torment because nature is so important, and he was silly to think that he could sort of beat nature, whereas nature is all powerful. But on the other level, if we look at the political meaning here, Wordsworth's comment on society and the social changes and the Industrial Revolution, then there's a clear message that this can only be bad, certainly for the romantics, but for the general public. And the mental anxiety caused by obviously poverty and disease and pollution, and all the hazards of machinery, not to mention the effect that it has on the landscape and nature, is obviously, we can't ignore that in this poem. Okay, so what other poems clearly stand out as ones we can compare to? So we've got similar ideas conveyed, and these are just a handful really I've suggested here, but obviously they're conveyed differently using language, but the ideas are here, and that's what you should be looking at. So for instance, if you look at Kamikaze, both speakers reconsider their perspective on nature, and both are overwhelmed by nature's power and influence. In Ozymandias, the poems obviously show nature as more powerful than mankind, but it also deals with that pride and arrogance and eventual fall. And we also see that kind of that journey, that sort of emotional journey in Prelude. In Storm on the Island, you have nature is violent, but in Prelude, you see it in a more spiritual, psychological way rather than in a practical way as it's dealt with in Storm. And then London, you've got man's ignorance, the wealthy limit mankind with, so the wealthy are limiting mankind with rules and regulations. And in Prelude, mankind, it suggests through Wordsworth's message, needs to wake up to the fact that the advances in technology are all at a cost to our mental well-being. So he's quite a visionary, really, in many respects. If you would like to do some wider reading and get a further understanding of the Romantics during the Victorian age, then this is a really lovely series to watch. It's on iPlayer currently, so we're autumn 2020. But we'll try to get this onto Frog as well, but certainly it's available at the moment. And it's The Romantics and Us with Simon Shamer, and I think it's 3 episodes which do look at Wordsworth, they look at Blake, and they look a little bit at Shelley. They look at some others as well, but it's really nice to get a handle on what was really happening at the time, and how massive the Romantic movement was and how important it was for all sorts of reasons. So I highly recommend watching that if you can. Okay, thanks very much for listening.